anybody who has showed up. I am here. I am not healthy, but I am here. I believe I can do my 2 hours or however long it is of hanging out and talking to people. So although actually, you know what? I'm going to want to have window, because maybe I need to look something up. That is sometimes a thing that will happen. I'll have a quick peek, see if anybody's here. It's also possible that people are too busy doing holiday things to come and hang out with my silly butt up here in a Vermont live stream. But then at the same time, when I do check on participants or something in chat, that's not necessarily going to show me anything. What it's going to do is, I guess, show me logged in people and completely skip anything else. So what I'll be doing is hanging out and seeing if I have questions to answer from anybody. In previous live streams, I've had a bunch. Again, maybe because it's the holidays, it's possible this time I won't, but we'll find out. Yeah, you're quite welcome, Cosmic. You know, and as far as the being so dedicated, I was thinking of something this morning, which was like, if I had a job at McDonald's and I had a job at Walmart and I had a job at a Dollar General, I would not get to take the day off. So why should I for having a job of plugins? Now, that said, Casroval, specialized plugins, that's kind of the thing. That's kind of how my thing works. So what I can do today is talk you through some of it. If there's anything specific going on that it would help you to know about, because if you sort of start from the beginning or start from particular places, well, in a way they are categorized. Like I'm going to go to airwindows.com now. So I go to airwindows.com. I've been updating some things, like I'm now calling the sidebar thing a Patreon promo club. Because it turns out most people who are spending a lot on the Patreon don't actually want to put a link anywhere. Go figure. But along the sidebar of AirWindows, there's a thing that says kinds of things, and that is categorizing them. There is like categorized down the sides that include things like dither, consoles plus, compressors plus, EQ, reverb plus, tape plus. The plus means that there's a complicated pile of other stuff involved in there. However, one thing you could do is ask, since you got me on the line, as it were. The categories I've done are about as good as I can, but they're somewhat overlapping. Like there is audio unit and VST also as categories, and it overlaps between stuff. And of course, free is a category that just keeps getting larger because that's what I do these days. Bestsellers is probably not going to change unless I have some reason to believe that a plugin that I do is becoming extraordinary, or possibly that I go and track down how many downloads everything has got. That might be interesting too. So, categorizing. Some of the stuff that I'm doing is like when it's in category dithers. That is things that are on the end of the whole mixdown and convert floating point audio to some kind of saved file that is fixed point. That's a definite category right there. When there's audio changing software, what I'll have is for instance, tape. When I say tape, what that means is a number of things. And more than anything else, it's going to alter the sound rather than leaving it the same. It's probably not going to be wildly adjustable, but sometimes it is. And it's typically going to be rolling off and modifying the high frequencies rather than making them brighter. Also, you may or may not have a bass boost in a tape style thing. It depends upon whether I'm trying to model a head bump, because tape heads have a resonance, and that resonance will give you a more expanded bass. Something like the category reverb plus is fairly obvious in that reverb is acoustic reverberation, but that will also include like echoes and things, most likely as well, or ambience effects. Arvin, thank you. And that's a very interesting question. I can take off from that. Kazroval, you might find it useful to listen to some of these conversations. And if that ends up discussing stuff you're interested in, you'll start getting some of the answers as far as which specialized plugins. I'll quickly answer, Bo. No, nobody's offering to help do GUIs for the plugins. I've said on a number of occasions, I need to be able to see a couple of things in order to be able to go forwards with the GUI thing. I need to be able to do an audio unit GUI and a VST GUI for 3 different platforms. If I can't do that, I'm not super interested, and because they need to match. And they also need to work back to like really older computers. Both of those platforms could do that. But that's not to say that that they will, or that anybody is doing it. Honestly, I'm not sure people are really interested in supporting legacy computers or anything. People seem to be very excited about just throwing away older systems and gear, and I don't go along with that, so I'm not getting a lot of support with the GUI proposal. I might try getting help from my brother, my genius corporate programmer brother, who can figure out anything. He just needs to have very specific tasks to work on, and then he will sort of bowl his way through no matter what. that's something that could, like when I finally got a working Linux thing, I had literally all of the plugins ported over to it in the matter of like a month or something. I just went boom, hi, everything's now Linux too, and that's what I prefer to do. In the way of GUI plugins, I would not be doing that. Instead, I would be coming up with distinct things that existed as the GUIs and not some sort of like all of my plugins lacked this, because they don't. They're designed to work the way they are. But I would do GUI stuff, including, favorite stuff like compressings and limitings and such. I don't actually have a limiter at the moment. I would be doing that if I had GUI up and running. But I need it to be up and running in a certain way so that it relates to what I do as far as what's accessible on the Air Windows platform. Back to Arvin. No, back to coffee, then back to Arvin. So, AD clip, NC17, and one corner clip are distinct things. They are quite separate behaviors. And in many ways, one corner clip is kind of a specialty thing. It almost doesn't fit in the same context, but it really sort of does. What AD clip will do, and I'm going to do my little sketching of drawings as much as I can. AD clip will take energy. Jolie, don't worry about that. Apparently I have all the time in the world, and yeah, it's been really hard to come out with new products, as is evidenced by the fact that I have, and don't delete it, it's a funny comment, but it's like, I think that a lot of people would be quite happy to have me releasing fewer products. One a week is really kind of overwhelming. So, a regular clipper would just chop off the tip of this wave. Like this is a waveform. Anything like AD clip, I'm not sure if you can see that, but is going to do the clippy thing. But then it's also going to round off the onset and departure samples as you go into and out of the clip. It does that on purpose. It's doing it part of the algorithm. And I think maybe I'm trying to remember whether I run a sample of latency doing it. If anybody really needs to know that, I can look it up because it's online source code. But that's what the AD clip algorithm, and also clip only, does this rounding off the corners. What AD clip also does is tries to sneak in a sort of echo of this clipped energy into the audio somehow. And it's if it's bass stuff, it's rounding it off. If you had a spike, then it might include the spike. But what the reinforcement stuff in AD clip is doing is it's not only doing this rounding off thing, it is also bringing energy back in from what was taken away. It'll keep track of this and try to fit it back in somehow. And that can be good and that can be bad. It's not necessarily, it's not musically related stuff. It's just energy. And if all you care about is energy, then that might work out with certain audio music genres. Then you might not hear the reintroduction of energy. If you're doing like dub techno or something, which is, it's got very obvious clips, and then the background music is very smooth and chill, then the bringing back the energy might not be any help to you whatsoever, because it'll be obvious. It'll stick out. So you don't want to use AD clip when working on really clean music where you can hear any funny artifacts. NC17 treats it like a big old sort of blurry area, and it does bring information back in from what's clipped off, but rather than having a smooth hard clip section, NC17 is doing its clip and then reintroduce the energy on basically density. NC17 is doing a soft clip that immediately starts like at 0. It's not even like this. It's like the entire range of it onto full clip. And I'll get to that, Julie. That's what I did put out yesterday. Let me see now. And lastly, one corner clip. One corner clip works kind of like this. Whereas if you've got your clip point, actually no, that doesn't even make any sense. Let me fix it. So here's our clip point. What one corner clip does is if you've got stuff that just overloads immediately, God, excuse me. AD clip does its thing with softening the onset and exit from clips over one sample, and it will always use the same amount of correction. Like if your sample is here and then the next sample will be up here, it's always going to take a proportion between that and the point of clipping. So it'll be like, 0.6 of the way to the iron bar and then full clip, and it'll go from there. This softens the brightness in intersample peaking of the clipper, and it also takes place on the exit so that it just smooths the square wave. I'll use that as the square wave example. So if that's your square wave example, then AD clip always does this to it. It always softens the entry so that the overshoot that you would get would be smaller. It's rolling off high frequencies, and it's doing it without actually touching any of the legitimate samples. Only the clipped samples do this. Like it's making it so that if you have a sequence of totally clipped samples, the first one is part of the way, the second one is fully clipped, iron bar 1.0 or whatever you want to use it, which is not actually a good idea, but and then as you're leaving, and this is why I think I'm running a sample of latency on AD clip 7 as well. When you're leaving, it'll do a intermediate sample there as well. One corner clip is different in that one corner clip does not go directly to the full crank. What one corner clip does is it slows it down so that as soon as you're clipping, you start from where you're at and then you start approaching the clipping, the iron bar as we call it. Which means that if it's a slow one, it might not ever actually get there. If it's a slow enough approaching of the bar, you can have it set up so that as soon as you start clipping, you just continue going horizontally at whatever point you're at, which completely changes the behavior of the clipper to something much weirder. The result of that on the sound is that if you're using one corner clip to clip for level or something, if you're really pushing hard into it, setting the speed of its reaction, how fast it does this, there's like a frequency control or something, voices it. It makes it so that if you've got it set very slowly, it's going to reinforce low frequencies more than high frequencies. Because as you're doing this clip, rather than going to where the signal legitimately was, it's going to make this low frequency shape, this slow curve. And that'll come across as a low frequency shape rather than a high frequency spike and a bunch of energy. Basically, it's reshaping the parts, only the parts that are clipped. So, I'm doing a real answer on this one, clearly. Clip only, safety clipper. It's not going to do much extra to cause stuff to sound louder than just plain clipping, but it will soften the entry and exit points. AD Clip 7, sort of a fancy safety clipper. It'll do that, but it'll also reintroduce energy if you want it to, and you can voice the degree of how soft its voicing is supposed to be. NC17, sort of noisy roaring clipper in which the exact point of where it starts clipping is more ambiguous. It's less obvious where you're hitting clip because everything becomes a little dirtier with NC17. Oh, I've heard about you're running into the Reaper indexing bug. I'll get to that. And lastly, one corner clip is useful for if you want the clip to be sort of dark and dirty and reinforce more low frequencies, because it will exaggerate that tendency to, suppress bright clippiness and switch it all the way over to really slow reactions and bassy kind of sounds. It depends upon whether you're going for a really slammed, exaggerated, distorted quality or cleanness, as it were. And there's only so much cleanness you can get out of any of these if you push them. So one of the tricks there is don't push them. If you're going for stuff that sounds clean and actually good, and you can live with like RMS loudness levels not being totally overwhelming, which is advisable with like replay gain happening, then what you do is just use something simple, like, 80 clip is fine, clip only is fine, and just don't hit it so hard. That'll work pretty good. So let me scroll back and see what else I've got that might, there's the one that I just answered, and I think I have just explained one corner clip pretty well. I made it because I could, because I knew that I could take that principle and make it like I can exaggerate it so that when you go into a clip, it'll just slowly start rolling over. And that'll be super low in artifacts and just change the voicing of everything. I think we're over to Gary. If you were introduced to your plugin collection today, how would you go about getting to know such a large collection? There's a number of things about that make it a really interesting question. Although I should quickly confirm to Jolie, the plugin raw timbres is, yes, the tone shaping from Ditherme timbres without the noise shaping. It is a EQ that does its EQing with quantization, and it does it at a very, very quiet volume level. It doesn't affect anything above that level, and it comes with the opposite one, which is raw glitters, and that should be fun for people to play with. But yeah, and I'll also confirm that there's a bug in Reaper where their organization of menu items is not the same as every other digital audio workstation manufacturer. So when you run I think it's audio units on Reaper, or is it audio units and VSTs on Reaper? But yeah, the how to approach the collection. Well, one of the things I've done is make new updates.zip in such a way that I can, or that you can just drop all of one category of plugins, and by that I mean VST, AU, whatever, into the workstation. You don't have to pick and choose. You can pile more than 100 plugins into your folder all at once. Is that useful? Not necessarily. If you enjoy that, that's kind of why I did it. It makes it very easy to have everything in the workstation, and then you can start playing with it. But as far as exploring it, you'll have to have some clues. You'll be looking at a bunch of names that don't mean anything to you. Like, even when I'm working with my own plugins and finding them for making another video, I'll sometimes be poking around. Marwan has brought up an interesting idea. That's actually what I did with, let me see, in a recent thing. Yeah, Marwan, I did this on Unbox. Unbox is the recent plugin where I was implementing that. It was an experiment. I haven't run much farther with it. But I haven't finished answering the how to approach a large collection of plugins. And that's very legitimate because the way that I organize it is by basically just making the large collection available. The idea is, if there are plugins there that don't relate to what you like to do, then they shouldn't be in your folder. Like, take them out of your plugin folder so that they're not bothering you, because it'll just clutter things up otherwise. In some cases, like multiple versions of density and channel, which is kind of like density, and spiral, you can have, and I have indeed made, lots of different variations of just plain overdrive, just distortion of whatever kind. Not necessarily a clipper or a smooth clipper or anything like that, but just plain overdrive, just dirt. A transfer function that is not the same going out as it was coming in. You know, another example of that is fracture. Fracture is a distortion that continues to wrap around again into a sort of loop, so it becomes a wave folder. That's what a wave folder is in modular synth. So, if you are not the kind of person that just loves playing with slight variations on things, then you need to make some command decisions as far as, like, okay, today I'm going to audition a couple of different plugins that do distortion. That would actually be a damn good category for me, so I'll make a note of that. Distortion. That would be a really good YouTube category, and that could be a category on my website. And if you click on that, you will get all of the plugins that do distortion. And you might want to go and just audition all the different ones that do distortion and pick out the one that you like best. Like, I've got a guy who's been corresponding with me, because people correspond with me in a bunch of different ways. And he swears up and down that, like, channel 2, the API setting, is the most golden magical channel ever to exist. And given that channel has been my test bed and has almost always used the same algorithm, it's almost always used just a simplified version of density and a wet-dry blend on that, and then it's had the same little slew clip and high-pass filter throughout its entire existence. So channel doesn't change very much between number versions. It always just has to do with some of the subtleties of how I implement things. So to form opinions about only this one is good and the other ones are terrible kind of doesn't really work with me, because it's like, yeah, there is you can have very similar plugins that sound different simply by implementation. And I've been experimenting with some of those things. One of the recent plugins has had something like that, and that tape delay uses a, I think about roughly 24-bit, maybe more. I think it's actually more. Tape delay is running like a fairly high resolution, like 30 or 28-bit or so linear delay bus inside it. Just because some of the calculations that I do on it are easy to do in fixed point. And it initially started out with fixed point. So I updated it a little bit by giving it higher resolution, because I believe when I started it out, like the original tape delay was a 16-bit fixed point delay buffer, and I decided that I could do a little better than that. But you can have stuff where the implementation inside it only differs with regard to, like, is it a double or is it a float storing the variable inside? Because a float is 32-bit and a double is 64-bit. And if you're keeping like a delay buffer that you've done some calculations to, and the delay buffer is like echoing and repeating things, what you could get is this delay buffer that will sound slightly different based on whether it's defined as floats or doubles. And I've done experiments with that kind of stuff. I remember doing experiments with that on Space Odyssey, or Star Child, actually, I think is the one. And, it looks like I'm going to have something to talk about in a moment when I finish this topic. When people fuss about plugins that are all the same line of thing, but there are subtle differences and they get really worked up about which difference it is, there could be some legitimacy to that. Like with Star Child, if I'm remembering correctly, I defined that as a delay buffer that was in floats rather than doubles, as it had its effect, or some calculation in there was being done in floats rather than doubles, because it needed to either that or fixed point, because it needed to be a little crunchier, because the atmosphere that it was creating, I needed that little tinge of like extraneous noise down at the bottom of the noise floor there. And it just sounded more legit as an old school delay ambient style device using that. I think it might have been fixed point, I forget. But that's something you can do. You can implement delays and things using different data word lengths and such, and those will subtly affect the sound, and people can form judgments on what they like best, and it's not always going to be more accuracy is better. Sometimes it'll be, less accuracy on this gives it a crunch and a flavor and something that's just right for what you're doing with it. Now, that said, let me scan up a little bit and look at what else is going on. Marwin has been putting plugins through that sine sweep test. Yep, that's going to be really scary. Even people who do the plugin aliasing test with like a sine wave that's a fixed frequency that's not perfectly aligned with like 997 hertz or something, that is nothing compared to doing a sine wave that sweeps up to the Nyquist frequency cleanly and then trying to distort that. It will just make any plugin lose its damn mind. This is partly why when I'm doing my own music and stuff like that, like there's stomp boxes down there and a guitar and an ISO cab and stuff, and there's a synthesizer, which is the Behringer D, that runs into a Devi Ever pedal. A truly beautiful disaster. It's another distortion. And I'm doing a lot of that stuff in analog just because, you know, I like the sound of it. That's my model. When I do plugins, it's based on what I need to hear coming out of music, and generally I'm implementing that in my own stuff in various forms of analog ways. I'd like to be able to show people how to do that more easily as well. Hopefully I'll be able to do some of that. I will certainly answer questions about the crazy electronic music stuff that I do on Tuesdays now. Brick wall low pass filter. I'll scroll back down to catch up with you guys later, I promise. Again, Unbox is my experiment with that. And you could do that with plugins with bad aliasing. In fact, if you were to do that, maybe I should make a plugin like a multi-average. Here, more notes, yay. As I actually have worked out how to do multi-stage things where I can bring additional stages in to intensify the effect. I can do that on one knob now, and so I do. I forget where I started doing that with. I did it with something. I think I did it with a compressor of some kind. But yes, you can manually put a pre-plug-in low-pass filter in, and that will take the loss of the high frequencies, but that will absolutely cut down the bad aliasing. No question about it. So, beginning to catch up here. Air Windows Synth. There are things that I could maybe do. The trouble with that is, again, I would want to do stuff on Mac and PC. Not that I use a PC, but it seems like it would be like lacking in class to start putting out stuff that was just only for Mac again. I'd want to do it as audio unit and VST. Both of those allow for making synthesizers, and I haven't experimented with any of those things yet. I don't know how to take in MIDI, and I've sort of looked at the things like the audio unit sine synth and stuff like that. There's definitely ways to start approaching this. It's just a little bit over my head at the moment. Like, I've been thinking about digital audio in terms of just buffers of samples and things and working with those. And I haven't been thinking nearly as much about what could be done with synths. Plus, there are already stuff. Wow, that's grammatical. There are things out there that I quite like. For instance, I haven't touched them in an awfully long time, but I own Massive and FM8, and the one that I really love out of that is actually FM8. I have used FM8 in one of my tracks, and I did a really cool sort of dubstep. So, with regards to synths and stuff, I mean, I could do that, but then, since I don't know how yet, I went and got one. And, you know, it would not be so I can't believe that there is nobody out there that has done, for instance, a really good FM synth. FM is honestly, I just like the hell out of it as far as the synthetype thing regarding not being your analog filtered or modular style thing. It is kind of like modular though. Some of the cool stuff that you can do with FM is very modular-esque. If I'm not mistaken, what I did to make the FM noise that I liked best out of all the time that I spent using it, I had an operator and a modulator, and I was using something where there was a crazy distortal bandpass effect on the modulator rather than on the I shouldn't talk about this until I have the terminology clear. Honestly, I'm using these things more than I am programming them. Let's see, where are we at? We're talking about Matt. You can't have a linear phase EQ with no pre-rigging. They might have something cool though. I can take a moment and look it up and see if they're, because honestly, some of the snake oiliest kinds of things are when they talk about their stuff, but their language doesn't add up. And they're not actually revealing much about implementation, is when I start to get suspicious. Like, if people are talking about new innovative type stuff and I can get something out of it, then it's probably real, because if they're revealing enough about it that I can figure out how that works, there's something legit to it. And generally anytime I see that, if I do something, it'll be my own style, so it's not a direct competitor anyhow, and I'll never have access to anybody's code, so it's like legit enough. Now let me look at this. God, excuse me. You're just going to have to deal with me blowing up the mic from time to time. This is the only way I can do it. This doesn't have a mute button. And even if it did, I would be scrambling to engage it a lot. So looking at that, looking at their page a little bit, they're crapping on typical EQs because they're basically implying, yeah, EQs are typically biquads. The funny thing about this is biquads aren't linear phase. Biquads have IIR involved, which makes them subject to using console processing. And so one of the things I'm looking to do is start getting a little better at fooling around with biquad implementations and getting EQs where they're a little more controllable. However, they're saying this is not a linear phase. Maybe they're just minimizing it. What that part says, nothing. And see, they can be doing linear phase, or they can be doing phase issues, which is not necessarily a problem sonically. Anything that you have with regard to like a nice colorful Moog filter or wah pedal or something like that is going to have loads of phase issues. That's just what you got. That's what an EQ sounds like. So not necessarily a concern. And they correctly say that yes, digital gives you finite impulse response filters, which don't have to be made with no phase. But when you make it with no phase, that is what you get, is pre-ring and post-ring. And they combine, and it's not necessarily great sounding. Yeah, one of the ways you can make a highly complex algorithm that eliminates audible pre-echo and post-echo to the highest degree is to cut down the Q. And I'll show you what that means. Hi-yo. If you have this, this is going to isolate the filtering thing that you're doing with this convolution kernel more than this. It's basically how that works. Like, you could sculpture something so that it's almost like my average filters. You could make a finite impulse response filter that does this. That's not going to make a bunch of pre-echo or post-echo. It's also not going to do your filter shape the way that you want. I'll draw the filter shape above these things. Here, we'll call that one, and let's pretend that they're like, I don't know, high passes or something. So what you get is this one with all the pre-ring and post-ring, clean filter behavior. It'll just isolate the stuff, and it'll only have what you want in there, and it has the pre-ring. That's what you get. If you have this one with much less pre-ring and much less post-ring, it's going to be a smoother thing. It's not going to have that clean, high resonance cutoff. And if you have something like this where it's not even attempting to do the filter shape or whatever, you're going to get weird artifacts. It'll try to do this sort of slow cutoff, but then because you've got these corners down here and you're just making it like a plain old impulse, you're also going to get like additional bands coming in here. When I have done averaging filters, I do averaging filters where it just starts bringing in successive samples, and every time you add another one, it'll sort of slowly amplify that up until it's full volume and then start bringing in another. As you do that, your filter wave shape gradually sort of evolves, where you get this really steep node, and then you get what seems like comb filtering, where the equalization curve is sort of like weep, weep, weep. And that shifts as you manipulate it. I don't think that's as undesirable a sound as people behave it is, although it's a weird looking filter behavior. But that's one way to get away from the pre-echo and post-echo, is to just manipulate it in that way. And from what I'm seeing, I'm still looking at this. I probably shouldn't hover over it for too long. I do like that they're supporting macOS 10.8 and newer and Windows 7 and newer. They get cool points to me for that because they wouldn't have to. The price, they do not get cool points for me for that. Holy crud, $890? Some of my synthesizers cost less than that, and I'm telling you, I've got better filters than some of that stuff for less than $890. You could just go out an output and into whatever in analog and avoid your, bad plug-in audio problems. Anyway, enough about them. Here. So let me catch up with the notes or something. That was me talking about Matt, their orange EQ. So, oh, also before I leave this subject Cosmic is talking about, I'm not really clear on the exact details, but that plug-in synthesizer that deadmau5 is involved with is damn nice. I think it's like Serum or something. I forget exactly. But if you're looking for like software synthesizers, plug-in synthesizers and stuff, there are some that exist that are already pretty darn slick. And You could do worse. Like again, that one that deadmau5 likes to use and that he got the guy to build him a special copy or something like that. That's a pretty darn good synthesizer. All right. E competition. So Purist Drive. And I got some conversation in Purist Drive and Gullfoss before scrolling farther down. You know, Purist Drive is a distortion, but it also has some sort of high frequency muting qualities to it. So what it's going to do is give you some harmonics, because that's what you get when you have mellow overdrive. Is it'll bring out like a harmonic above whatever it is without a whole pile of other harmonics that might alias back or something. So if you don't slam into Purist Drive, then yeah, it'll give you a little bit more cut, because it'll give you like a little bit of harmonics, and they're probably not even going to be aliasing unless you're forcing really high frequency stuff into it. Because when you're generating harmonics smoothly, you get them one at a time. And if you're not generating the harmonics beyond the Nyquist frequency, it won't alias. So you can have no aliasing out of a simple plugin that doesn't use fancy oversampling, just by conditioning it in such a way that it's not generating a whole series of harmonics. If it's generating them basically one at a time, then you've got all the way up to 10K or so before you'll run into serious problems with it. You know, when I looked at Gullfoss, I figured out what that was about, and that is basically a FFT-oriented measuring of what resonances exist, and I like resonances, so I'm still not going to like it as much. Lots of what I like in audio is about having really intense resonances. Like I've got what I've got over here, the Juno section. One of the reasons I'm so in favor of the Alpha Juno as a synthesizer is it can cleanly put out disgusting levels of resonance. Like you can really have these sort of shafts of light coming through your mix that are just like, and if you did that and ran Gullfoss on it, it would make it sound less like itself. So when it makes the sounds that I enjoy most sound less like themselves, I don't like it very much. It's just, that's my personal attitude. And again, I did also say that on percussive things and drums, that could be very desirable. And I know that you could make the Gullfoss do the opposite, and it feels a little bit more like just manipulating stuff. I'm not that much of a fan of breaking things up into a million little bands and then trying to reassemble them. I'd rather work on things in a more organic way. So the whole principle of how it equalizes things kind of fails with me. I don't like analyzing stuff that much and sort of chopping the audio into bits that much on the assumption that you're reassembling it, but you're still reassembling it in a way where, like, if you're doing your FFT algorithm and everything is stored at 32 bits, then you're recording all the little quiet, subtle things very nicely, but you're also doing a bunch of different calculations that will result in quantization. And every single time you do that, you're taking another chunk out of the audio. It'll get degraded in the most funny, weird ways, where, like, the stuff that's loud winds up getting a little bit coarsened, and then the really delicate stuff that's being recorded with all of your floating point details. So that's basically okay, but then as they're getting combined together again, they're being combined in such a way where you've got to sum a whole series of values, and then they're being summed also in 32-bit. You know, it's like, not so much of a fan of that kind of thing. It's like people getting fussy over linear phase EQs or something like that. before I scroll down farther, what is my favorite plugin that I've created? Well, gosh, let me look at the innovative section, which is rather large, on aarondoes.com, and I'll scroll down that and see whether anything jumps out. No, I don't like anything. No, seriously. I like some, I could say something like Unbox, because that's a pretty, it's an interesting new way of doing things, but I haven't actually used that for anything. I tend to like the dithers and things because those are direct attacks on the stuff that I dislike about digital audio. So I'm more likely to like the dithers. I'm not sure if I would go so far as to say that I like Dither Me Timbers best yet. I'd probably still have to say, like, Not Just Another Dither is my current fave, because it's the most high performance thing I've got going on so far. It's got limitations, but typically I will like stuff that is recent, and more, it's hard to say what's my, it's like, what is your favorite sound in a rock band? And because I'm an old classic rock, prog rock person, and you're like, okay, so I could really like drums, and then I'm completely ignoring Moog synthesizers. And what about those Rickenbacker basses? I crave like getting a Rickenbacker bass one day. It's probably going to be able to happen at some point. I'll save my pennies, and and then it's like, okay, well, but then none of that means much without guitars. And it's the same with plugins. It's like, how can there be a favorite plugin when sometimes I want like Spiral for a really smooth distortion saturation that has a analog-y feel and more tonal honesty than anything I've done before. So that easily gets to be one of the favorites. But then those dithers, I value those dithers much. And then it's like, what do you do with something like bit shift gain? And bit shift gain is like nothing. That's just do a plugin that can multiply by 0.5 or 0.25 or 0.125, etc., etc., etc. Just hardwire in all of this very basic math that has the result of changing the exponent of your floating point value and not touching the mantissa at all. That's what the math says to do. It's nothing but a multiply. It's nothing but the most primitive form of gain change. It's just in knowing what matters and how to do that. So that's another favorite, and it's incredibly trivial. Go figure. Let me scroll down. Real life has face issues anyway. Well, real life, but then that's part of what makes it be real life. Like, that reminds me of a video that I saw recently. Somebody mocking high-ender audio people, because they had all of the funny, like, this little chip of wood floating in the air on a special stand that's a plinth resonates with the sound of the universe. And it's like, there was lots of that, but then they also had radial Strahler speakers. And radial Strahler speakers are a German speaker design that's literally omnidirectional radiating. It's multiple bands. It's got a tweeter and then a mid-range and then a sort of woofer and then a real woofer, because the subwoofers, the design factor that they have is not enough to be able to really go deep into the bass. And those are designed to be in a room where they will echo off of the walls. In fact, in my little home theater setup, I have something much similar to that, where there's a speaker design much smaller that it intentionally bounces off the wall, so you're supposed to be able to hear the bounce. You're not supposed to be like, okay, it's bouncing off this wall, so acoustic padding, acoustic padding. Instead, it's designed to sort of incorporate that into how your ears hear the sound. And when the sound is omnidirectional and the immediate first impression is coming off of the speakers and then also bouncing off of all the closest, most adjacent walls, exactly as if it was being propagated by some source that was more omnidirectional than speakers usually are, including all the high frequencies and stuff, your ears stop hearing the walls. You hear through that stuff, and rather than hearing it just like, oh, this is the room and it sounds bad, you kind of skip it. Let me keep chasing these questions. Yeah. I don't think there's such a thing as phase problems. It's just changing the sound to be different kinds of sound. A bug report. Oh, well, but bug report in Cubase 10. I'm really kind of worried about what Cubase 10 is doing. One hopes that they will support their own damn format without being an enormous train wreck. I'm not sure I trust that, because they want to destroy VST2, and I'm committed to doing VST2 because it's more widely available across other DAWs and stuff. So they have a agenda, or they have a legitimate purpose to destroy their own stuff with planned obsolescence in order to only be able to have people using VST3. I'm legal for making plugins in VST2. The thing is, if they push that too hard, they're only hurting themselves. And if they're doing things where they are intentionally sabotaging VST2 plugins in Cubase 10, there's really kind of nothing I can do about that. It's like when implementations of audio units or VSTs are really screwed up in a DAW, or like you can't type in the value. Often there's nothing I can do about that stuff because the DAW makes the sliders and things. So I can end up pretty helpless. I hope that they don't do anything too scary in Cubase 10, because there's not a lot I can do about it if they do. Yes, and I am aware of the upper slider invisible issue in Cubase 10. It is a thing I can do nothing about. So I can hope they fix it, and I couldn't begin to tell you whether they're going to fix it or not. They may just be killing VST2 in Cubase 10 and trying to get people to go to it, knowing that that's happening. Or it may be just for generic only, and that'd be pretty sad, because I depend upon being able to put a generic only, because honestly, it's should be the easiest way to implement stuff. Keeping it that simple should have the widest range of things working. It depends upon whether people are trying to do their planned obsolescence or not, so there's not a lot that I can do around that. I hope they fix the problem. Scanning downwards a little bit more. Goldfoss has a master EQ. I don't think it's a good idea to have a master EQ. I think you should be doing the stuff in tracks or maybe buses, but honestly, like, I'm working with a analog board, which is not the fanciest, but I like the sound of it. It's a Roland M16. It's a rack-mounted board with tiny little knobs. And it's got EQs, and I'm pretty happy with them on the whole. But I would rather have a way of doing, like, I'm working with a bunch of synthesizers where their whole sound is usually coming out of some kind of filter. And I'd like to just run without equalization even on the tracks, much less on the summing bus. So I would not have any master EQ. And if there's an exception, it would be around things like, I don't know, using console and some peculiar variation on console, like atmosphere, where it's doing a equalization-like effect. I get how that's kind of like a master EQ. What I don't like is the idea of running literally an EQ on the master bus and like coloring and tone shaping it and stuff. A mastering engineer might do stuff like that. A mastering engineer might also have like $40,000 specially built unobtainium based hardware mastering EQs to apply to things. I know a guy, Dave Collins, amazing mastering guy, has a design for the EQ that he uses in mastering, and it is entirely analog, and it is unbelievably expensive because it's not a complicated circuit. It's a fairly basic EQ circuit where you can do what you would be doing with like Dolphos, but not automatically chasing it, because I think that's not a good idea. But just applying like, okay, here's a little bump here, and this whole track wants a slight cut over here, like master EQ, but it's done using analog gear of very high quality or entirely passive, and most of the money is going into like 64 position silver plated switches where every tiny little variation on the frequency or every tiny little variation on the volume, because it's recallable volume, is using a 64 step silver plated switch that's like yay big and a giant knob just to do half dB increments of less or more. And as you decide that, that's going through different like dedicated metal film resistors of like 0.1 percent accuracy, and then the frequency setting is like a double or triple stage multiple switch, and that's got 64 little adjustments for like 300 hertz and 305 hertz and 310 hertz and so on. And every bit of that is going through an entirely separate batch of capacitors. Every little thing has its dedicated purpose to it. Do that and you can justify having a master EQ, because it's going to be incredibly good about not just degrading the sound pointlessly. So funny thing about Ditherbox, I actually recommend using the dedicated Dither plugins. In particular, I think Not Just Another Dither works better as the dedicated plugin, and I don't know why. That's very frustrating. I've certainly worked on it, but I found that I'm just not getting the same results out of the one that I've got implemented in Ditherbox. So if you settle upon one basic kind of Dither plugin, I recommend doing the ones that I have just that one. Put it on there and forget. You shouldn't be fussing with, like, you do not use different kinds of Dither as a mixed choice. It's like, no, build that into your whole system. Consider it being like your speakers or something like that. And you don't do mixes through swapping out the speakers to see which ones seem to fit with the mix best. Instead, it's part of your basic system. So decide on a, Ditherbox, yeah, I made it available. Yeah, it's got all these different options, which have not kept up with raw timbres and raw glitters, and I don't expect to. But I would more suggest working with the individual dedicated ones. I think you're going to get better mileage out of those. And I don't think different Dither flavors are a good idea for mixes, because you kind of want to have a house sound. Honestly, I mean, it's like you should be able to pick a Dither plugin that somebody else thinks is weird and stupid and get away with it. Like, if you decide, like, okay, everything has to use tape dither because that noise, it's a TPDF, so it's like legit. Nobody can fault you for it. But opposed to like TPDF or Paul dither or something like that, you could be like, no, tape dither is the one where the noise floor has a particular quality to it and everything just needs to be like that. You should be allowed to do that rather than being like, oh, I need to use not just another dither for this, because it's part of having a house sound. Come up with what articulates what you're about most and go with that. And it doesn't have to be what other people would like or justify, but it's like your choice of speakers that you mix over. Some of the things in a digital mix can be malleable, and I feel like some of them, particularly stuff like dither or whatever, should be the same. And I'm not alone in this, because like on another forum I hang out occasionally, and by occasionally it's like every couple of years we exchange words, with William Whitman, who the guy that engineered Cyndi Lauper's True Colors and also plays bass for her and a lot of stuff like that. And he is notable for scorning the idea of swapping out preamplifiers for things. You know, you've got like a contingent and Gearslots and whatever who are like, oh, you should have this different kinds of preamps because you might want this preamp for a bass and you might want this preamp for a female vocal, but this preamp for a male vocal. And this guy is like, no. Nave, API, maybe some variations on those that are more homebrew but are equally comparable. That's about it. He's like, no, you shouldn't be using pre's for, like, he doesn't even necessarily use different microphones for things. And the result is that there's a consistency to the stuff that he does, and also he is making his choices in like positioning and actual EQing and so on and so forth, rather than fussing around a lot like, oh, I don't know, I think this preamplifier is creamier. It's like, no, get everything up to the stage where you can't fault it and then just go from there. I'm strongly of that opinion, which is ironic considering how many different variations of plugins that I'm making, but they're all within this concept of you should be able to find your pet plugin among God, excuse me. Let me skip ahead a little bit. Sensodyne asked a while back, I'm just getting caught up to this, what makes a saturator plugin good? That depends upon what flavor it is that you want. Like, if this picture that I drew today were the saturation outputs, so rather than having it be straight clipping, this would be a soft clip, this would be even softer, then basically what makes this saturator plugin good is partly this. And remember, good is subjective. I've got a user who is very key to remind me that anytime I say not to do something, he'll automatically do it. You could do stuff that is weird. Here's a not good saturator plugin. If you've got something that's supposed to be a smooth change in transfer function, but it has a corner or a point, people will usually find that to not sound good. They will usually find it having a sort of funny artifact in sound quality. You can actually observe that. If you have this, try this out sometime. Take a sine wave, like a nice low frequency sine wave of some kind. And if you have Dewey tape, I'm not going to repeat that because I'm not here to down on people or stuff, but this is one of the reasons that motivated my creation of iron oxide. And I'm sure it's the same as it's ever been. Take your sine wave, run it into that plugin with a volume ramping. Like, your sine wave test thing, here's another wonderful sine wave test thing that you can make. Rather than just a frequency sweep, you can also make a volume sweep where you have a nice test file, which is your sine wave. It like goes up to 1 or maybe a tiny bit less just to be sure that it's clean. Select the beginning and the end of it and do a fade out and a fade in so that it ramps up to full volume and then back down again. If you do that in a 2-track editor or anything that can do fade outs and fade ins like that, you'll find that it's doing it very nicely and smoothly. It's not going to produce a lot of artifacts with this nice continuous change in level and then back down again. But if you feed that into the plugin that I mentioned, you'll find that it makes a flanger effect as it goes. Like, and I didn't, there's no way my voice today is going to be able to make the sound I'm talking about, even if I could. But that is because as the waveform small to larger, if as the waveform goes from smaller to larger, it starts hitting points where the gain that it's at like abruptly changes in some way. Here's how that kind of works. If one side of your waveform is a sine wave and it's going through something like that and it hits this point where there's a small change, it might be an audible tick or some kind of noise, and it could be very, very, very faint. But if it's a sine wave, then it's making that at extremely regular intervals, meaning that it will cause a harmonic. It's not a very loud one, but you'll hear it. And if the sine wave is slowly ramping in volume, you will hear that intersecting the top of the wave and then splitting and slowly extending downwards into more of the wave and so on, which is changing the positions that it's at, meaning that you've got harmonics that are kind of moving in different directions, much like aliasing. In fact, I would say that it is kind of like a kind of aliasing. And this is a really good example of what's not a good saturator, is if they have those little points on the saturation curve where it abruptly does something different or changes in some way. That'll give you a sort of bright, fizzy artifact that's like an overtone. It's like a ring or buzz. And it'll be harmonically related, but it'll be I'm tempted to say aharmonically related, in that harmonically related makes it sound as if it's in tune, and it is not. But it's related to the frequency, so yeah, it's just aliasing. Basically, it's just another kind of aliasing. That is an example of what makes this saturator plugin bad. As far as phase is concerned, I'm not sure how much that matters. I would bet you anything that Purist Drive does things with the phase in high frequencies, because it's literally working with a delayed sample to alter some of its stuff. And that is going to cause like changes in the interaction with the high frequencies and stuff. That, like, for people who are completely in love with Purist Drive and related plugins like that, then I would say that, yeah, phase helps that sound better, but I would be hard-pressed to specify exactly how, like what kind of phase sounds more good. I don't really know. It's a question. However, I would say this. As far as the saturator is concerned, there's definitely no benefit to trying really hard not to have any phase irregularities. That's not how that's going to work at all. Like if there was some kind of version of the FIR linear phase, an FIR linear phase distortion, I'm not sure that would be useful. So, on to some questions about dither. As you can see in the picture, which I think is still showing, yep, absolutely. So, I think that you need to dither to 24 bits. If you're saving as 24-bit files, you should dither at the 24-bit level. That's why all of my dithers are essentially at 24-bit level by the get-go. If you are dithering to, like in Logic, at least some versions of Logic have done their MP3ing by making the 24-bit file and then MP3ing from that. In that case, you would be dithering to the 24-bit file. Now, if a DAW is definitely doing its calculations from just the bus directly, or if your intermediate file or your saved file is a 32-bit floating point thing, you don't dither to floating point. You don't dither to floating point that is going to be used to make an MP3 file. It's always like whether a part of your output destination is specifically fixed point. And there's no such thing as a 24-bit 320 MP3 file. At least, I'm not sure whether the internal representation of an MP3 file can have 24-bit or 16-bit stuff. I do know that it is completely irrelevant to the kind of dither we're talking about. So there's no such thing as a 24-bit 320 or 24-bit anything MP3 file. It's always just a 320 or whatever MP3 file. Its internal data structures are entirely its own thing. Sleep Circle has got a lot to say about this. It seems correct so far. Let me see. So first of all, ain't no such thing as a 24-bit 320 MP3 file. If you've got an intermediate file that's 24-bit, then yeah. If you've got an intermediate file that is floating point, then yeah. But Sleep Circle actually, you may have tested that out. I'm hesitant to vouch for that one. It also depends upon, maybe you've tested it out with some kind of high energy noise shaping thing. Like if you tried to make an MP3 off of Power R3, for instance, that produces a bunch of energy. Or Ozone's noise shaping. Ozone's like highest quality noise shaping throws a bunch of extra high energy in. And you're correct that an MP3 encoder will get freaked out by the additional energy. However, dither noise as such is pretty much always going to be below what the MP3 encoder cares about. There's no MP3 encoder, even at 320, that is going to really care about digital noise floor. Certainly at 24-bit, probably even at 16-bit. It's just much coarser than that. It's yeah, I'll get to you, Bernie. I'm thinking about the Sleep Circles, because Sleep Circle knows a bunch of this stuff and is correct in many ways. I'm just, mostly, I don't think, not only that, but, hi, here comes that boy, you're 5 and don't know how to spell, hi boy. let's not get this too distracted. I'm talking about dithers here. I can scroll up if it becomes spammy, so don't worry about it. It's just not a problem. So what I'm talking to Sleep Circle about here, dither noise and how it relates to MP3. The deal is, dither noise is uniform in frequency. It's going to be down at the noise floor. It's going to be thrown away by MP3. More even than that, if the file needed to have dithering, then you should use it in some whatever way it is that you're using it. Because if the audio is being saved to, like, say you're doing 16-bit to the MP3, use dither or not, will it throw off the MP3 encoder or not? If you went to, say, 16-bit, where it has a chance of affecting things, if you didn't dither, then the MP3 encoder would be trying to encode like hints of artifacts that you don't want. So there's no way around it. Basically, if there's a reason to dither to fixed point, you're always going to want to do that. And there is no way that it's going to harm an MP3 encoder. Whether you're using like noise shaping or stuff, you could have a kind of dither. I think my old 10.9s, which became vinyl, can generate a bunch of energy as well. But heavily noise-shaped dithers that produce, like Sleep Circle said, a whole bunch of noise at a certain frequency, you might not want to use that for MP3 encoding. And the file would end up slightly bigger than it has to be. That is one of the things that would happen. So far, so good. So yeah. And that's when it would happen too. So yeah, you're correct about all of those things, but that basically just means don't use noise shapers if you're really concerned about that. And it's probably not going to hurt you as a rule, because you're already doing MP3, so it's already hurting you because you got to deal with MP3 anyway. Now let me start answering some other things. Bernie asked, do I mix and master a 24-bit? Well, is your DAW running on 24-bit bus? Because I can promise you that it isn't. The DAW is going to be running on either a 32 or a 64-bit floating point bus, so you're mixing at probably 32-bit. Depends upon what system you're working on. You're monitoring a 24-bit, and that's why I think it's good to use one of my dithers, the 24-bit ones, at the end of your monitoring chain, because your converter is probably taking in 24-bit. But you're mixing at 32. You're probably recording at 24-bit if you've got it set to be that. And it's kind of like there's not a really... It's like me capturing stuff on my music jams to 24-bit. It's like if you're just capturing to it, you're not really working from a higher resolution. Or technically, the converter is probably capturing at a much higher sample rate and a lower resolution, and then kind of decimating it down. And that process is integral to itself. So you don't really need to be concerned about that. And then you're mixing at 32-bit. If you're saving things like stems, you can have the DAW save those as 24-bit. If you are mixing in analog, you can have a whole bunch of outputs all outputting at 24-bit. If you're doing that, you should be using the 24-bit dither, because why not? That's technically correct to do. And you don't have to be fussy about it. Just decide something that you think that you would like and then go with that. Be like, my subliminal, what's that stuff? Oh, God, now I can't remember. Oh, my homeopathic dither is working just great. Just pick something and do the technically correct thing and go there. And then exporting to 24-bit, again, you dither to that. Anytime you're making a file or an intermediate stage where you're going to be reading off of that and it's a 24-bit thing, then you dither to that. So, platform that I use to code the plugins. That's a good question. On Mac, I'm using an old laptop that is running OS 10.6.8. It's like Snow Leopard or something. And that is so that I can target Mac OSs as old as, like, I don't know, Panther or something. The idea is to be able to put out like PPC builds and target incredibly old things so that all of this stuff can be useful even in kind of like crazy homebrew projects where you're like, I just have this antique laptop here that takes in digital audio from the input jack and then puts digital audio back out, and it is my echo unit, except for that it also has some filtering. And you should be able to take your old cast-off equipment and do stuff like that that's cool with it. And so I make it possible to do that. So I'm using an old version of Apple's compiler. What am I? Let me look at applications. Xcode, that's what it is. I'm using an old version of Xcode. And I think I spelled out what that is in the how to compile these plugins things that I've got, which I can't get into too much detail about because I need the setups to be pretty consistent. Otherwise, I would just lose days trying to get them to work again. On Windows, I'm doing it in a virtual machine that has a Windows 7 install that's like never seen the internet. I think I had it set up so that it did its initial little updates and things, and I was like, okay, no internet for you. You talk only on a USB thing. And everything goes through the Mac OS, which can't sustain Windows viruses. So it's this little test tube Windows, and it's Windows 7. And it is a somewhat more recent version of Visual Studio Community something. And it's just compiling the VST stuff. And then on Linux, it's a relatively recent version of, I think, Ubuntu. And that is compiling the Linux stuff that way. So those are the platforms I'm using to code my plugins. They're all sitting on an antique laptop. It's an Intel laptop. It's not PPC, but it's still a fairly antique laptop. Jolie has an interesting observation. Logic does give the option to export a bounced as 24-bit MP3. Really? Seriously? As opposed to 16-bit MP3? Because the thing is, MP3 is a format where it's storing like JPEG instructions on how to reconstruct. Oh yeah, I do Linux. I'm very proud of the fact that I do Linux. I wouldn't let that go for anything. Let me scroll that back. Yeah. 24-bit MP3. MP3 is just MP3. If you have an output file that decodes the MP3, it could be using anything. And I think a lot of the MP3 playback things typically just do stupid crap because they don't know any better and they're already lossy audio and they're like, this is fine. So they don't do anything really to... I have sometimes been ambitious of like, I want to figure this out just so that I can make like a MP3 player that dithers from the floating point bus or something. And I'm not aware of a way that MP3 would be 24-bit at all. Like, maybe all that means is it makes a 24-bit file in the course of going to MP3, which is what you would want to do. You would want to do that. If there's like 16-bit MP3, maybe it's just dumping out a 16-bit file and trying to make that be MP3, and that's just silly and dumb. You don't want to do that. But MP3 itself doesn't come in variations like that. I don't think you get to be like, okay, this is the super high resolution version of MP3, because it's always just storing instructions to write out the eventual code. And then the MP3 player has to make that stuff up and put out a series of samples. So, yeah, Marwin is correct in every sense that you're monitoring at 24-bit, but the DAW is still thinking in 32 or 64 for some of the VST hosts, and then outputting at 24. All the core audio stuff is still 32, which is basically okay if you know how to use it. I won't walk right into the... but let's not fuss with that idea. We'll not go down that line of thought. That will only lead to grief. Xcode and visual. Yeah, Bo is trying to get better at coding. Yeah, C# is not part of any of this. C# is the Microsoft version. I think there's a Linux version called Mono that is a variation, sort of like an attempt at making a better C++. So probably what you're thinking of is C, and I can tell you this about, because I'll happily have a conversation for our last half hour or so about C programming. I don't know a lot about it, but for that reason I have maybe an easier time talking to people who know absolutely nothing, because I'm not all highfalutin and full of really complicated stuff regarding the programming. You know, a lot of the expertise around there, I don't have it. Instead, the expertise is in the DSP and the willingness to do stuff DSP-wise, and always has been. So when you're talking about C programming, like tell me a plugin. I will talk about how I coded it in C. And then there's a lot of framework stuff going on that is how it becomes an audio unit or how it becomes a VST plugin. But yeah, name a plugin, anybody who's still here. There could easily be anybody still here, or people might have already left. We'll find out. I never really know that unless I see people talking, so. If you don't name a plugin, I'll pick my most recent one. Oh, Sleep Circle, you think that Logic makes an intermediate file that might be 24-bit and might be 16? In that case, you would be using the dither for either of those things. And there's no reason you would ever do 16-bit output to MP3. Let's go and got my actual window. Ditherbox is too complicated. I don't suggest using that. On the other hand, I could. Let's go into Ditherbox. I was going to pull bits of code out. Yeah, high resolution comes from throwing more information at the problem, much like JPEG. The 320K is the highest quality because it is retaining more information about how it's doing its thing. It's the difference between doing a half-decent job of avoiding bad sound versus like cell phone. So that is absolutely correct. And it's all being done in just stored instructions, much like JPEG or something. So let's see, we're going to the Mac version, and I'm going to scroll down to Ditherbox. I'm not going to be able to show you this, but you could follow along. I'll throw you a link. And I'm going to go to the C++ file. So, no, you said Ditherbox. Let's go to Ditherbox. Whoop. So, Bo, can you follow that link? Anybody who wants to be part of this tutorial can follow that link. I'll read from the top of it quickly, and I'll tell you when I get to the audio stuff. And technically, I could make another window, but yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure what is about compressing 1/2 wavelength. What I do know is that that's going to be too complicated. Yeah, don't worry about it, Jolie. So see, I've dug into this kind of stuff before because I have been very, very, very interested in. Oh, hello. You want to do butter purist warm instead? That is very simple. This Buttercomp is going to be much more complicated. Ditherbox, which I've got up right now and I gave a link to, is going to show some C type things that will tell you how that stuff works. And Purist Warm is just so simple, there's almost nothing to it, so there's less to talk about in that. Let's do Ditherbox. You said Ditherbox first, and I've linked to it. For failing for that, somebody following along can go to the GitHub and then go to the MacAU Ditherbox source code, and you'll see where I'm up at the moment. So we start at the top, and it says component entry Ditherbox. I don't need to care what that means because that's part of the template. Some of this stuff is just what the audio unit gives me to make itself work. Stuff like create elements, set parameter k param1, k default value param1. That means this is my control. It's a control. Debug dispatcher, I don't know what that does. I've never had to care. There is no debug dispatcher in the VST plugin. It's just part of this framework. I scroll down a little bit. It says get parameter value strings. This is something where I had to define things called k-menu items, and they're just little names. And it's asking, like, if this, if we're making a audio unit happen and the 2 ampersands means and. It's a logical and. So it's like if this thing and also in parameter ID equals kparam1, that means, well, I only have one control, but if we're doing that control, it says, C string ref strings. When it says strings and there's a little brackets in there, it means this is an array. This is a bunch of something. And the k menu items are constants. K in the beginning means constant. What that means is you're just making some strings like words, sentences, typing, letters. And the commas make a big list of these things. Yeah, I may end up doing this a lot. This is a very obvious call for stuff that I can do in a live stream. So I might end up having to have people settle on something that they want me to go over, but I'm more than happy to do it. You'll see that there's the list of all the stuff in there, including not just another dither, and then there is HR. That is the internal name for what I called the 24-bit ones. That as it keeps going, it starts doing them over again, but calling them HR. And those are the ones that need to become 24-bit. I'll keep going. On get parameter info, there's a place where it says case kparam1, and this is where the audio unit gets told, like, what kind of control is this? Is this like a 1 to 0 control? Is this a control that's supposed to read in decibels? Is this a control that needs to go from like 3 to 105 and a logarithmic curve? And audio units can do all that stuff if you know to tell them. So where it says get parameter info and then case kparam1, it's saying AU base and the 2 colons. This is part of C++, but I don't have to actually use it making the plugins. It comes with the template. And what I need to care about is where it says audio unit parameter unit indexed It could be parameter unit generic, in which case it's going to be like a floating point number. Min value and max value might be 0 to 1. Since this one is indexed, it is using numbers, and these k truncate and k silhouette, those are numbers. I could have written them in as numbers, but I'm using them as constants because that is, hey, talk to you later, Sleep Circle. Apple liked defining them in this way, so I'm going along with what seems to be the style at the time. And k truncate is like, I think, 1. I'm going to skip back for a second. Stay with that, but I'm going to look at the other box H. Yeah, when I'm defining them in the .h file, which is short for header, k truncate is 1, and k silhouette is 25. There's 25 things in this menu. I also get to set a default value, which is 22, which is the 24-bit, not just another dither. Going back to the C++. So that place where it's telling you what the control is, this is where I tell it like what numbers go on the knobs, how the knobs are articulated. It might be very generic as in 0 and 1. VSTs always use parameter unit generic, min value 0, max value 1 by design. In the VST, if it shows anything else, it's because I went into the VST display thing, and when it was going to display like 0 to 1, I told it like, okay, show this plus 3 times 8, you know, or times 8 plus 3, and then it's faking showing a different scale of numbers in the VST, but the internal way that VST remembers this stuff is always 0 to 1. The internal way that audio units remember stuff can be more complicated than that. Like indexed means it's a integer number, or you can tell it to have different values, and that means that you can tell the audio unit, oh hi, this value is 6,205,000, and it'll go okay and store it. And that can be dangerous because that means that you can end up with like Ableton Live randomly telling it that one of the values is 6,000,002, which it has done. And I've had somebody with bugs where they had tape delay exploding on them because Ableton Live randomly told them that the feedback was like 6,000,005. And if the feedback of that plugin is 6,000,005 and I didn't tell it to sanity check that, which is worth doing, it could be something that I could do more of, even though it's fairly rare for things to be that crazy. Audio units can store more interesting saved values of stuff, and they're not limited to 0 and 1. VSTs are limited to just 0 and 1. And that's all we need to talk about get parameter info for the moment, is that's telling you how the control works. Get property info and get property are empty. There's nothing going on in those. And there's a reset below that. I assume that Bo is still following along with this, and anybody else who is on GitHub doing it. Because right now you can chatter away as much as you wanted, because I'm actually scrolling a different window. Reset is defining a bunch of variables, and I mean a bunch of variables. It's going on and on and on. There is a variable called byn, B-Y-N, that is an array. It was defined as being an array that has at least 0 to 10 places in it. Again, it's like those other ones from the controls where if you have the square brackets, that means you've got an array and you can put in a number and look at a different value depending upon what number it is. Like you got your tackle box, and this is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're separate. You can look them up separately. And you got assorted things like noise shaping and last sample and IR sample A to Z, which is a weird way of doing it, but I like doing it that way because it's very primitive and simple. And then we get to the meat of it, which is process. And that's at the bottom, and this is where most of the action is. So here is, while I am doing this craziness, I'm going to be a little funky here, and I can see your reactions, but now the viewer cannot because the viewer is watching the actual code. Ta-da! So I'll scooch this out of the way a little bit, and then I will refer to my picture here showing me what I'm actually seeing. So, I just told you about this stuff up here. We may be doing this more often, and if anybody says anything, I will read it, because we're no longer showing you, we're showing the code. So, this stuff up top, BYN, and then the parentheses, that's an array, that's multiple values, like a tackle box. It's separate places to store numbers. And you don't see here what kind of number we're storing. However, it's probably a double. Unless, well, they seem to be integer values, so maybe that's an int. We'll skip over that for now, because this is the guts of everything. This is process. And I got like 9 minutes to 8 minutes to cover some of this before it's time for me to log off. Unless, keep commenting if you want me to keep talking about this. Otherwise, I'll breeze through it and then say goodnight. But if anybody is really benefiting from this, please do type in the chat. Oh, for the love of God, keep going. So this is process. This is most of where stuff works. And you can see at the top, it's got this place where it says process const float 32 asterisk indest p. That's where you're getting your buffer. Well, you will see that in this very thing, although it doesn't really relate to dithers very much, so this is a poor choice for that one. Where possible, they are coded to work properly at bit rates of over 44.1K. That's from way back. That's from like 2007 I was doing that. But there are some of them that'll work differently. Because if I have a average thing and it goes up to like 9 places of average, and you do 9 places of average at 192K, it's going to sound very different. So, or more relevantly, if you have a delay plugin and you've got 1 second of delay at 44.1K, and then you expect to run it at 192K, you could still have the delay plugin, but it's going to be like 1/4 the delay time, or you define 4 times as many delay parts and then don't use them for all the 44.1K users. Or you have the defining part being separate so that the defining part uses the sample rate, which you can get access to define a buffer based on what your sample rate is, at which point you can kill your entire computer if your computer randomly tells it, oh, hi, my sample rate is 3 million, just for a moment. If it does that while the plugin is trying to define its sample buffers, then it'll just go boom and try to define a sample buffer that's larger than your entire computer memory. So my choices in making these plugins have been to define rigid buffer sizes. So basically, if you can load it under one condition, you can load it under another condition. It's not a thing where it's like I loaded it under 44.1 and it was fine, and then I loaded it under 196K and it blew up and crashed my computer. I don't want that to happen, so I make it use the same buffers for every sample rate. But that said, let me move onwards, because now what we're seeing is the code. Also, up at the top here, part of what's defining it, it says void. What that means is it does this thing and then doesn't return a number or a signal or an answer to whatever it is that called it. Instead, it's this thing, process, is being called on the buffer of samples that are in source P. You're supposed to put your result in indest P, which is another buffer of samples. It's like an expanse of samples that like yay big. And how big? Well, that tells you in frames to process. In frames to process means this is how many samples are in the buffer in source P and indest P. They're going to be the same size. So in frames to process is your latency. That's where the DAW latency comes from. If you made the latency be like, from 4 milliseconds to 16 milliseconds or whatever, this is what it's doing to change that. It's defining more frames to process so that it can do that stuff all at once. Because if you're doing ultra low latency, you're telling it like, okay, in frames to process, 8. Just do 8 of these at a time, and then we're going to go on to the next channel. And it'll do all those channels, and then that's your audio latency, and then it'll keep going. That's a lot of switching among channels. It's too much switching among channels. So that's why when you set really low latency, the DAW tends to fall over and die, because it's not getting to do this in big bursts. And I will be showing you why that is relevant. I'll get to the bottom of this one, skipping over some of the algorithms, I think, just because I might as well. So we'll continue onwards. Like here is in frames to process. As you can see, we're doing like n sample frames equals in frames to process. So we're using that number for something. Some of this stuff like the source P, in source P, des P, indest P, that's just more template stuff. It's not like I think that stuff up especially for each plugin. It just rolls. It works with whatever it is. Here's some of the stuff that I thought up. Contingent rand, absample, contingent. Here is the sample rate stuff. Overall scale equals 1. Overall scale divided by 44/100. Overall scale times get sample rate. That gives me a number that varies based on what the sample rate is. Like if I'm at 88.2, then overall scale is going to be exactly 2. Overall scale is going to be whatever I need it to be. And that means if I have things like, make this thing react this fast, I can make it react slower or faster based on overall scale and the sample rate. IIR amount is also being, actually no, IIR amount is not being affected by a sample rate. It could be, but then it's being adjusted by overall scale here, just below. And we've got a bunch of other things, smoother bridge rectifier, which I like using. Benford eyes is something that's only in, not just another dither and so on. Here's a funny thing. I've got these things called constants. They're very long-winded variables. These are actually weird mathematical significant things of great significance. Like the trim natural logarithm of 10. They're in very high resolution. Usually there's no special reason. I just found that my sweet spot for dialing in that variable was getting to be a a value around there, and I was like, there's a mathematical constant that sits there. Maybe the sweet spot is centering around this constant, and therefore that is the ultimate ideal setting for this. Let's just use that. And so I would. I've got a couple of final notes there. Also, normally one says k Randy constant, k omega constant, kx constant, and specifies like constant in the code. You could say like static double and static double k Randy constant. And that would make it a constant, meaning that the compiler would know you'd never be recalculating it. And that's good. In fact, that's a very good thing to do. It's just not something I've done very much. I have a more primitive version of coding and lots to learn. So I'll be straight up about that. Now, we'll scroll a little farther. Right at the top of the screen here is where I use that control. The control that I was talking about earlier. Int dtype get parameter kparam1. And it's +1 for Reaper bug workaround, which did not necessarily work. Oh, no, 618. I use that in lots of stuff. It's definitely 1618. I know that because I use it so much. Or 0.618, as a matter of fact. It's this sort of other angle. They're parallels to... Oh, sure. Well spotted, though. So, yeah. Absolutely right. Randy constant does actually happen to be the golden ratio. That's what I chose to use for that. Maybe we'll see later why I chose that. dtype get param1. It's an integer. I'm assigning an integer variable to this param1. I am also, when it says int at the top, in the parentheses in front of the thing, that's called a cast. That is telling the program, that's telling the compiler, like this get parameter, get param1 here, behave like it's an int. Consider this thing to be an int. Because I think get parameter gives you floats or something. Like you can set it to be an indexed value. And that means that the parameter is going to be set to always like 1, 2, 5, 27, whatever. But then when you read it, it gives you 1.0 or 5.0 or whatever. So I'm just telling it to be an int because that's what it's supposed to be, and it saves me getting a warning about it or some kind of complaint, a bug. I think I might have this set up so that it does a bug if you're taking a float and telling it to be an int or something. Now, I scroll a little bit farther. See, dtype was the thing that I made that was the control. Now, here's how some of this stuff works. Like, see, where it says, if and my way of arranging this is not the way that people normally do, but when I have really small stuff like that, I might be doing it in some awkward and goofy way. Where it says if dtype is larger than 11, that's an if statement. It's making a choice. If this number is more than the thing, and I might have even found a bug. That'd be interesting. Probably not. I think it's doing what I thought. Oh, no, I still know what it is. If you see, it looks like a bug, but it's not. See, up at the top of the screen, it's like if dtype is larger than 11, high res equals true, meaning if our number of our menu item is larger than 11, we always know we're going to be either at a high resolution version of the plugins. 0 to 311 is always just the low resolution. So if it is larger than 11, high res equals true, meaning that it'll start doing the different, it'll do the 24-bit rather than the 16. And then it says dtype minus equals 11. So if it's larger than 11, it'll take it back down again so that it becomes that much less. It's like doing the same list over and again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And then 12 through 22. And then as you're reading it, you go, okay, this was 12. So 12 minus 11 is 1. So it's whichever one was in the algorithm level 1, but we've also said high res equals true, so we're doing it a different amount. It's sending me to the same place at 2 different places on the plugin control thing. Give me a number from like 1 to 28 and going from there, and I'm making it do it over twice, but under different conditions. Then, after I've done that, it says it again. It says if dtype is larger than 11, then what? And what that means is I have 2 copies of this 11 list of dither things. Underneath that, I have the monitoring ones. Slew only, sub only, silhouette. So if dtype was one of those, that's a really larger number. So it'll automatically be high res equals true, dtype minus 11. So we're taking it back down again. And then guess what? It's still higher than 11 because it's off the end of that list. It's not the 2 different ways of doing the dithers. Instead, it's the extra ones. So it says dithering false and high res equals false. It's doing a flag that says, actually, never mind, we're doing a monitoring thing. Skip the whole dithering and go from there. So it looks like it's repeating itself, but it's really not. And you'll notice it's not changing dtype anymore because what I have is a big switch that goes 1 to 11 for all these different dithers. And then the other ones are more things in the switch. So the next thing we see is my denormalization. And the denormalization makes a tiny little noise to stop floating point units from freaking out. We'll skip over that because that's way beyond teaching somebody their first C stuff. We'll skip up to where it says source P equals in-num channels. And we're incrementing that kind of thing. Like up top here, it says, while n-sample frames is larger than 0, input sample equals source P. It's going through this list of samples that you've been given. That's your latency. It's your buffer. And doing them one by one. And this time, the input sample is the one that you're on. And we don't always increment that thing in that place. But for this one, for some reason, my source buffer is getting updated right up here. So it's being updated plus in-num channels. The reason it says in-num channels is because you see it's way up top here. It says in-num channels all the way up here. These plugins are end-to-end. This is a mono plugin. It's getting done a couple of times around if you're in stereo or quad or whatever. But the in-num channels, basically what it would do is if you've told it, oh, by the way, all of my stuff works in quad, so everything that I'm doing, I only work with 4 channels, and this is how we work with that. You'd set it up to say, okay, only give me audio and say that in-num channels is 4. If you did that, it would say you int 32 enum channels. That would be 4. Up at the top, you would say like input sample 1 is source P1 or however they do it. 2 is source P2, whatever. 3, so you'd be taking 4 in a row, 4 samples in a row. And then down at the bottom, or down here a little ways, where it says source P plus equals enum channels, that's getting ready for the next sample along, the next step along. And if you were doing quad, it would say source P plus 4. You know, go ahead, do this whole thing, and then when we do it again, because it says while n sample frames is larger than 0. In fact, it says while n sample frames minus minus is larger than 0. Minus minus means while we're even asking this question, we're also subtracting 1 from it. That's what while n sample frames minus minus means. This is the C-type. This is your basic C-type stuff that is kind of twitchy and strange. And eventually you learn it, you know, when you're just getting started. And then it starts to seem very trivial and you just mess around with C++ or whatever. But in your basic C stuff, you can do stuff like while n sample frames, which is going to be a number, it's going to be an integer, minus minus is larger than 0. That's a question you ask, and the answer is going to be yes or no. And even in asking the question, when you said n sample frames minus minus, you removed 1 from it. It even gets sillier than that, because you could also go while minus minus n sample frames, and that means you subtract 1 before you even ask. If you do it after the n sample frames, then you're asking, and then after you've answered the question, you go, oh, by the way, and you take 1 away. So the sample frames are the numbers of whatever it is you're doing. In these plugins, it's always 1. If you did like quad, then you'd be doing 4 different input samples each time around, and then it'd be like 4, and then 4, and then 4, and so on. And then source P plus equals enum channels would be source P plus 4, and you'd go along like that. Now, here's some other stuff happening. If d-type equals 8, there's a neat bug in here that you have to avoid for this stuff. Input sample minus equals noise shaping. D-type is the kind of dither we were doing. 8 is one of the ones that uses noise shaping of some kind. In fact, we will skip ahead a little bit. It's laid out kind of strangely, but this is 8. D-type is the thing we're looking at when we're going to these various places. D-type requires noise shaping. So up here, before we even get into this stuff, we say if d-type equals 8, that's asking a question. You could also say if 8 equals d-type. That would work too, and be wiser. Then if that's true, then we know that we need to include this as part of our calculation before we do anything else. Because for some reason we were doing it before altering this other stuff. Below that, we have if dithering, and that's dithering is a Boolean variable, meaning the answer to that question is always true or false. Input sample times equals 32768.0. That might not seem like a very large number, but that is the number of how many individual values you can have in 16-bit. Like that's it. Say 32,000 places, positive and negative, and that's all you got. 24-bit is 256 times that. So if high res, input sample multiplied by that. What we're doing is we're taking input stuff that is always -1 to 1, at least in terms of capturing stuff from the the input converters is going to give you a value of 1 to -1. You can work with stuff within the DAW that are much bigger than that. We're multiplying it so that the levels of 0 to 1 is 1 bit in a fixed point. So if you're multiplying it by 32,768, what you got is a end result where it's 1 bit for each 0 to 1. Like 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. Meaning we can turn it into integers, and that'll be at the relevant granularity for 16-bit or whatever. And that's exactly what we're going to do. Then I'm going to talk through a couple of the basic ones. It says switch dtype. Remember, dtype was the control. Here's where we start using the number that is. If it is case 1, and remember that it could have been either 16-bit or 24-bit truncation. We've made it so that like there's 11 different times, so that if it is 1, it's truncation in 16-bit. If it is, I think 12, yeah, it would be 12, then it is truncation at 24-bit. If it is 12, it's larger than 11, so it got subtracted down and that became 1. And then it's flipped on a switch that said, hi, we're high res now. So we end up back to 1 again. And there it is. You can see it right in front of you. Input sample plus input sample equals floor input sample. Truncate is always go to the integer value that is lower than where you're at. Throw away all of the floating point stuff and always go to whatever is lower as a integer number. That is all truncation is. That is the code for truncate. Flat dither is input sample plus equals rand double divided by double rand max. Rand is a random number. We want rand to be 0 to 1. So double rand max, whatever it happens to be, we're going to make rand be 0 to 1. The highest possible thing it can be is the maximum rand. That you could almost call that k rand max because it's a constant. It's what Core Audio has, or indeed maybe just Xcode has, sitting around as far as defined stuff to do C coding with. And when we say input sample plus equals, what we mean is input sample equals input sample plus this other thing. It's the thing within the parentheses. Whenever you have parentheses, you always like work out what is inside the parentheses first before getting any larger. So we got rand has its own little parentheses because it's giving you a number that's a random number. And then double rand max means we're dividing it by a double precision 64-bit number. We've got input sample minus equals 0.5. I think that might be a float, but I'm not really sure. If you write a number and the number has a decimal point in it, it's always going to be some kind of floating point, but you don't necessarily know what floating point it'll be. You could also see numbers written like minus 0.5f. 0.5f specifies it's got to be a float, so it's got to be 32-bit. And you're subtracting that, and then we're doing the floor again. And that is flat dither. It's one stage of randomness. We move on a little bit to TPDF. Let's get that sitting up at the top of the screen there. And TPDF, I'm going to stop with Paul dither because everything else is much more complicated. And it's already 119. And I got to go to the grocery store and also rest, get better. But TPDF is being done like this. Isaac Clarke is a silly man. I've got somebody in the chat who's like, Trump is Jesus. And I'm like, well, he's a different color. That might be one of my friends being a wise ass. Isaac, your window is not actually being shown on screen. And even if it was, I would deal with it somehow. Anyways, in case 3, you got input sample plus equals a random number, and then you've got input sample plus equals a random number again. So that'll do it twice. You could have also had like a for loop saying for random variable equals 1 to 2 kind of thing. But I like doing things like that very straightforwardly. Mike England asks, have I heard of mag audio? I was answering a question about that earlier in the stream. We're finishing up with the stream. Yeah. Bernie says, I can't tell if that's real or a troll. That might be a friend of mine for all I know. I got some nice wise-ass friends who could be coming around and fooling around. You never can tell. Could be anything. Let me finish up the talk about this code. So I've talked you through TPDF dither. It's adding the random number, which is between 0 and 1, twice. It's subtracting 1, and then it's doing the floor input sample again. And then beneath that, I've got Paul dither. I'll scroll so that that is at the top of the screen. Paul dither is add a random number, input sample plus equals current dither. That's the thing that you've just defined. So we add that. Input sample minus equals last sample. Last sample is a number that we get to store between cycles of this. It's been stored somewhere else. And input sample floor, input sample. So that stuff was the same as before, kinda. Then it says last sample equals current dither. Now that does an interesting thing. What that does is it's adding a random number, and then immediately it follows it by subtracting that random number. But that's enough of a randomness that it counts as 2 random sources. So it becomes TPDF dither. Because it's like you got the one random thing, and then the next time around you're subtracting rather than adding, but it's still including the random, and it's the one from the previous time you did it. So you've got 2 distinct random things going on. The one that you just made and the one that you saved from last time, which is going to be different. You're doing your entire calculation, and only then do you tell it, oh, by the way, last sample equals the one that I just used, so use that for next time, and subtract it for next time. And what Paul dither does is it uses the 2 random sources. That is causing a full TPDF dither probability distribution. But it's also taking any given signal and immediately subtracting it again. So it is a high-passed dither. It's a much more high-frequency thing while still being a TPDF. And it's a very recommended dither for a lot of things. There are a lot of people who like that. Now, as you can see, the further stuff that we've got going on can get very complicated. Like tape dither is not complicated. Tape dither is another thing where it's like add and then subtract something else and then make a chain of these little things where it's like 4 equals 3, 3 equals 2, 2 equals 1. It's just making a small delay buffer. And the dither is being delayed a little bit before getting subtracted from itself. And that's causing a different behavior, but it's still the TPDF. It's just echoing it differently. Quadratic is a weird one. I forget what I've called that one in the instructions. we've got this. This is the noise shaping one with its little variable that's being saved. 10 nines, also known as final. Up here we've got spatialize. Spatialize was originally called contingent dither. What that does is it only it tries to hover on raw values if they are coming through, like it's not going to take a value that's like 0.001 and go, hi, we're randomly adding 1 to that because random. Instead, it fights harder to keep it closer to the actual values being used. Here we have some of the code for original naturalize. Here we have not just another dither, which is a variation on it that works better. And then we've got some of these things like slew only and subs only. And you can see that slew only is keep a last sample, and output sample is input sample minus the last sample. And then there's a trim volume going on, and there's some keeping it from clipping going on. And subs only is a big old high pass filter. Stuff like this. And then as we get to the very bottom of the page, where I'm finished talking about this for today because I've done 2.5 hours now, and I do need to go to the store. Thankfully, I'm feeling a little bit better, otherwise I wouldn't be able to do this at all. We've got this place where it says break. You'll notice that all of these things where they have this statement, case 14, do this, case this, you have to have this break statement in there so that it goes to the place that you want. Like it goes to, say, this long one. 13, it goes to sub only. That means it skips over all this other stuff. It's a select switch statement. Let me skip right through here. See where it says switch dtype? That's what all this is. And you got your case, and you got your break. And right at the bottom, you can see that it's yet another one. And it said case 14. It's the last option to go to. If you had that in dtype, you would go right here, skip all this other stuff, and then say break, meaning skip anything else that's after this. And then we come out of the little curly bracket, and the curly bracket contains everything that was in the switch statement. You'll see some other ones at the bottom. Those are more curly brackets that define something that's happening. And at the bottom of the curly bracket, it says flip equals not flip. Flip is a Boolean. So the exclamation point is what you got to say if you're on Windows, or perhaps Unix. Apple Xcode lets you literally say not, but then it doesn't translate to Windows, so I've taken to just using that. And that line of code says flip equals not flip. Comment says several dithers use this. And then we go back up, or we go back to the floating point version, having set all of the truncation to the right size. So if high res, the input samples divided equals by 256. And then if we're dithering at all, and we input sample divided equals by 32768. And at that point, our maximum range of loudness and softness for outputting is, or at least should be, -1 to 1. And then, for some reason, I think dtype number 8, it wanted to work with the full range floating point level. So what that one does is it does that outside everything, because awkwardness and bugs, and the convoluted pile of code that this is. And it says noise shaping plus equals, meaning noise shaping equals noise shaping plus input sample minus dry sample. So it's whatever changed, it's storing that. And then in the end we have dest p equals input sample. Remember, if it says equals equals, you're asking the question about, is this thing bigger than the other thing? And that's why it might be useful to say if 8 equals D type. Because if it said, and at the bottom there, if D type equals 8, the answer is always yes, because you've just told it, oh, inside this thing that we're looking at, inside the parentheses, make D type be 8. And then outside the parentheses, oh, by the way, is D type 8? Why, yes. Yes, it is. We just said it was inside this very parentheses. That's why the double equals. And that's why it might be useful to put the numbers and things first. Because if you say if 8 equals D type, that makes sense. Because that means, you know, we're comparing a thing with another thing. You can do that in either order. If you say by mistake, if 8, 8 equals D type, that makes no sense because you're going like, okay, what was D type again? 12. Okay, cool. 8 equals 12. What? And the compiler throws an error because it's like, 8 doesn't equal 12. What are you talking about? So the equals compared to the equals is always a thing. Always, always a thing. And then in the end, we have desc_p, which is the location that we're putting the end result, equals input sample. And then it also says desc_p plus equals in num channels. What that means is desc_p is like a place in memory, and the asterisk refers to the stuff that you're putting into the place in memory. But you can, it's a pointer, is what they call them. So when you say asterisk desc_p, you can say asterisk desc_p equals input sample, and that means make it go to the relevant place and put this information in there. Yeah, Mike, I can actually see what you're saying. I've just got this screen up. I'm going to remove it before I'm completely done. And then when it says desc_p plus equals in num channels, that means the place in the memory where you're putting this stuff, skip down a bit. Like this is desc_p at or whatever. If in num channels equals 1, then desc_p, but go to the next one for the next time we go around. And that is it from that. So what I'm going to do is try to put this back. Successfully put this back. Good enough. So that is a first installment of talking people through coding. I'm going to let people specifically ask for that, but I can probably do that pretty much every Monday if it's desired, and we'll see how that goes. And definitely poke around, see what you can do on your own. But that's the gist of it. That's how you do the do. So yeah, mag and mat and stuff. Oh, I've heard of mag, that's hardware with a special airband. Yeah. That's very cool if it resembles something that exists in hardware, because that's a high standard to beat. I have been given to understand that that mag airband hardware device is pretty darn impressive. That said, fiddling with my windows a little bit. And I'm also going to have to work on my lighting because I have the video lighting, but it's really too bright when there's light coming in through the windows. I've got windows there, and they're very bright windows. So, what I'm going to do is bid you all good night. And happy holidays to that very, very merry. Happy holidays to all of them that are celebrating them. I'm not, but I'm going to a meeting Christmas Day this evening, and mostly I just want to go and get my groceries before you can't get into the stores anymore. Hmm? Hello? What? That's it, Chris? Chris, you're not getting it? What am I not getting? Well, the airband, anyway. So basically, what you're saying is cool. Okay, so what you're saying is you work with analog gear. You don't find plugins that normally work like this. Mine does. Cool. Bear in mind that you can get that technology in other Air Windows plugins as well. Specifically, energy. If you like the airband in stuff like my EQ for the channel EQ includes this technology as far as the bright, the treble boost contains that as a boost. And the Air plugin is literally that technology. Well, the plugin Energy, which is out and has been out for a while, is that same technology extended downwards into mid-range peaks. So if you like the way that the Air thing sounds, I'm directing you to another Air Windows plugin that is already out that has the same kind of mojo. Now, it's not very controllable. Energy is using a similar concept, and the tough thing about that is that it's not, you can't dial it very easily. But you know, if that's what your ears like, then you want to look into Energy, because that might also furnish you some useful plugin stuff that you can use. Yay! That's why I make them all. So, that said, we've done a nice little epic marathon thing, but that's because we did some useful plugin programming coaching that I will surely do again at some point. I'll be saving them for Mondays. This is what I do on Monday. And tomorrow I'm going to be doing a live stream, and I've got a slight variation on the music thing, because what I've got is a setup where, like, my on the Rhodes there, see the shiny thing on top of the Rhodes dials is a nano control. I've got my timing generator sending out key changes to all of the Arturia key steps. And the bottom thing there that I'm pointing at will set tempo for me, so I get to pick different tempos now. And there's a thing that says 8, 16, 24, and 27, and that will cycle through individual sliders, including them on the multiple stages, like when it's like stage 1, 2, 3, and 4, or scene 1, 2, 3, and 4. It'll work with that. And it's going to go through those sliders, as many of them as I tell it to, cycle through those, and if I move the sliders up from 0, it'll do a key change there for about 4 bars. And that is independent of whatever the key steps are doing. So the key steps can be cycling on a completely different rate. And then the key change will come along on regular intervals, making the sort of music composition maybe a little bit more interesting, giving me something to work with if I'm playing guitar along to it, so on and so forth. So that's the most recent change, and I'll be doing some of that. I'll be doing some of that tomorrow when I do the music stream, where hopefully I will continue to feel better and things will be excellent. We shall see. But for now, I will bid you adieu, and we'll talk to y'all later. Bye-bye.